perfect. And Mozart had this tremendous fluency and naturalness about his writing, which is really quite amazing. He's someone who's always very lyrical in his approach. What does that term lyrical, what do you think of lyrical? So think of lyrics, so that would have to do with, yeah, song, the singing, yeah. So it's a very singing style. All right. Then probably the most influential composer of the Viennese classical composers on the next era, on the 19th century Romantic movement, was Beethoven. The dates of his life are 1770 to 1827. And Beethoven is a composer who was a supreme individualist. And so he really unleashed the drama of the human ego onto the music scene. He was someone who had a very strong personality and very strong will. And he was able to overcome the afflictions of his life, which is that he realized when he was around 30 years old that he was losing his hearing. And so by the time he was writing his late works at the end of his life, he was completely deaf. And it's really quite amazing what the journey that Beethoven traveled. But his music has this epic quality about it. The works are extremely personal and very emotional. And so that is something that is characteristic of the 19th century, is this emphasis on the individual expression. So we'll study quite a few works of Beethoven. And then the Viennese composer Franz Schubert is the fourth of these four Viennese classical composers. And Schubert is known for his songs, the leader. And so he really developed that genre and was someone who, like Mozart, was very lyrical in the approach to composition. And he died at the young age of 31. And so we'll look at three of Schubert's part songs. All right, so the date 1750 is the traditional end of the Baroque era, and that date is chosen. One thing, it's a round number, but it was the date that Johann Sebastian Bach died. And so all of these, there's a fluency in the way that musical style evolves. And so it's not like all of a sudden composers said, okay, we're all going to write this way now. But there were trends that were developing 25 years or so before 1750 that led into the classical era. The same thing is true, the end of classicism and the beginning of romanticism. In general, you can kind of see, the beginnings of romanticism in the first decade of the 19th century with Beethoven's middle period works. But the traditional date that you'll see is 1825 or so. So that's about, the point where Beethoven died. And 1900 or so is the end of the Romantic era. There's an era that's known as post-Romanticism that continues the basic ideas of the Romantic era. But we'll be looking at quite a few Romantic composers. So some of the ones that we'll do are Felix Mendelssohn, so 1809 to 1847. are his dates. We'll look at some works by Frédéric Chopin. And Chopin died at the age of 39. He was the composer who wrote almost exclusively for the piano. And so just every work that he wrote includes the piano, but mostly he wrote for solo piano. So he's unique in that sense. Robert Schumann is another great genius who was born the same year as Chopin. So these first generation of Romantic composers were all born around this year, 1810. So Chopin and Schumann were born the same. The Hungarian composer Franz Liszt was born in 1811, died in 1886. He was the great virtuoso who was the undisputed king of the pianists in the 19th century and had a tremendous career as an incredible performer. And he modeled himself after Paganini, who was the great Italian violinist, but maybe even had more fame than Paganini. But at any rate, that was the era of the virtuoso, was the 19th century. And so Liszt really represents that quite well. All right, then we will look at one work by Franck. We'll look at the Franck Violin Sonata. So Franck is a French composer. He was born in Belgium, but he spent his adult life in Paris. And Johannes Brahms is a composer that was writing in the second half of the 19th century, a composer who was more conservative. Sometimes he's called a neoclassicist, but he was totally romantic in the way that his music sounded and in the intensity of expression of his music. Because that's one of the things, whether composers in the 19th century were more conservative or whether they were more avant-garde, they all had this desire to use music as a way of expressing this emotional intensity. So Brahms was born in 1833, died in 1897. So if you remember the number 3, that's a good way to remember his dates. So little by little, you're going to have to learn these dates. So first section, we'll have 5 composers. So we're going to look at Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Berlioz. So let me write him up here. So 1803 to 1869. And so that's an overview of the composers that we're going to cover. Let's see if I left anybody out. That's it, right there. Oh, I did have 2 more. Tchaikovsky. (1840 to 1893) are the dates of Tchaikovsky's life. And so we'll look at the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, the last movement of that great work. And then we will look at a couple of the art songs of Hugo Wolf, who also is a Viennese composer. The dates of his life are 1860 to 1903. And Wolf is sometimes regarded as post-romantic in many ways. And so we'll talk about that in that section on Reader. Okay, so what I'd like to do next is talk a little bit about some things that you'll need to do for the tests. About 40% of the test will be identifying listening examples. And I'll play, like 45 seconds of an excerpt of a movement. And what you need to be able to do is to identify the composer, so that'll be worth 3 points out of 200. The name of the work, so you need to identify the work in a way that it distinguishes it from the other works that that composer wrote. So if you wrote Mozart and you wrote Symphony, I would give you a little credit for writing Symphony, but you would want to write Prague Symphony or Symphony number 38. These are also known by their Kerschel numbers, K504. So you can look at the course outline, and this is the complete title of these works. And so just something that's going to identify specifically which work we studied. You then need to identify the movements. So on this first section on symphonies, we won't cover the entire symphony. We'll just do selected movements from them. But that'll be worth 1 point. So this is worth 3 points. Then I will ask you either the date of composition, and it's plus or minus 10 years, so you have to come within 10 years of that. And so we'll talk about these dates, but you need to know when they were written. So I'll either ask date of composition, or the dates of the composer's life. So that's worth 1 point. And then you need to know what the form of the movement is. So the first form that we're going to talk about is sonata allegro form. There are 9 different movements on this first listening part of the symphony. And I believe 6 of the 9 are in sonata allegro form. So if you're going to guess, if you don't, I'm not sure, well, that's probably your best bet. Sonata allegro form is by far the most important form that developed at the beginning of the classical era. And in many ways, that's as important as this monodic texture is of defining tertian harmony at the beginning of the Baroque period. So it's a form that you'll have to diagram on the first test. So may as well put that in your notes that you need to be able to diagram sonata allegro form. And if you look at those theme sheets, which the theme sheet for the symphony, on the first page is that little sonatina that we're going to look at on Tuesday. The second page has a diagram of sonata allegro form. And so that is the form that that little sonatina follows. That's the formula. So go ahead and look at that, and I'll talk about that here in a second and kind of go through the basic elements of it. But there are many other forms that we'll talk about as well. And so that then is worth 1 point. So about 40% of the test will be identifying these specific facts about the works that we study. And on the website is also a series of review questions for the exams. So if you'll click on that tab, you'll see review questions for exam number 1. And so it's like 3 pages of questions. You know, they'll all be things that we've talked about in class. So you might want to go ahead and be looking at that and kind of have your, listening for the discussion of those particular questions that are on those review questions. All right, so this first section on the symphony is going to cover classical and romantic styles. So one of the things that you need to be able to do is to write about classicism in the arts. And so that's the title of one of the chapters that you'll be reading in the textbook, is Classicism in the Arts. And I'll talk about that more on Tuesday. But basically what classicism has to do with is this adherence to tradition. And so it's something that is following this idea of, an outstanding, excellent example, and that everyone agrees that this represents excellence. And by adhering to the principles of that great work, that this sense of excellence can again be achieved. So classicism has to do with this idea of all composers are following the same basic principles. And some things then that you can say about classicism are that composers who are writing symphonies were all basically writing for the same ensemble. And they were all writing the same types of works as far as the number of movements in a symphony and the key relationships and the different tempos and forms. So the symphony is a genre, so that's a general type of work that arose in the classical period. Sometimes it's described as a sonata for orchestra. The term sonata is a term that first was used at the end of the Renaissance, but it was not used very often. But it then became associated with instrumental works, works that didn't feature voice. And so the term sonata means to sound. And the term sonata cycle refers to a multi-movement instrumental work. And so that's a more general term than symphony. So a symphony is a type of sonata cycle work. So a sonata cycle is a work that features multiple movements for an instrumental, either soloist or ensemble. And so examples of a sonata cycle are symphony, concerto, all different types of chamber music. The most important type of chamber music in the classical period is the string quartet. So I'll just write that as an example.